Hey, Jefferson Calico here. I wanted to go over with you the story of Hagar. It's a very rich story, and it shows how the biblical and the Quranic traditions are interrelated in interesting and complex ways. So, in the biblical tradition, the story begins in Genesis 16. It revolves around this issue that God had promised Abraham and his wife Sarah a child, yet they seem unable to have children. So Sarah is going to solve this problem. She has an Egyptian slave named Hagar, and she offers this slave woman to Abraham to sleep with. And Sarah, if the slave woman becomes pregnant and has a child, then Sarah will claim that child as her own, which points to the plight of the slave. There's obviously some human trafficking issues going on here. And Hagar does become pregnant. And when she does, then Sarah and her begin to have a conflict, because Sarah believes that Hagar is now sort of arrogant and is despising Sarah because Sarah is unable to have children. She mistreats Hagar, and Hagar runs away. And the story gets interesting here because in Genesis 16, the angel of the Lord, it says, finds Hagar near a spring in the desert. So she is headed south into the desert south of Canaan, and an angel finds her there. And the angel tells her to go back to the mistress and submit to Sarah, and the angel says, I will increase your descendants so that they will be too numerous to count. So that is something like a covenant made with Hagar, very similar to the covenant made with Abraham, descendants too numerous to count. The angel goes on and says, now you are with child, you have a son, you should name him Ishmael. That's sort of a negative view of Ishmael. He'll be a wild donkey, his hand will be against everyone, he will live in hostility with all his brothers. Well, what happens after that is really important in the story. It says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. This is Hagar. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. So she has this very intimate encounter with God. No one sees God, yet Hagar says, I've seen the one who has seen me. So the story picks back up in Genesis 21. And at this point, Sarah and Abraham have been able to have a natural child. This is Isaac. And during that time, Sarah gets, again, very jealous of Hagar and Ishmael. She believes that Ishmael is mocking them. And so she says to Abraham, you've got to get rid of this slave woman's son. And the biblical text says that this distresses Abraham, but God speaks to Abraham and says, don't be distressed about the boy, because I will make him into a great nation also, because he is your offspring. So now the story gets very interesting with a lot of parallels to the Islamic story, because very early it says the next morning that Abraham gets Hagar and Ishmael up and gives them some food and a skin of water and sets them off out into the desert out south. And so all this takes place in Canaan, south of Canaan, in the desert there. And of course in the Islamic story it all happens in Arabia, but the stories themselves are very similar. So Hagar and Ishmael are wandering off into the desert. They drink up the water, and then she walks away and she's crying because they're going to die, and then God hears them. And it says that an angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter? Don't be afraid. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand. And when she does that, then it says God opens her eyes, and then she sees this well of water. Now the Quranic story, or we should say the Islamic story, because very little of it is actually in the Quran. And the Islamic story is mostly told through the hadith. So this is Bukhari's hadith, collection of hadith. And the first thing that the Islamic story takes up is, where did Hagar come from? In the biblical tradition, she just shows up in Abraham's household as this Egyptian slave. So we see here an interesting interaction between the Islamic tradition and the biblical tradition. Because in the biblical tradition, there are, in Genesis, there are three of these, what are called sister stories. And these are stories in which the husband passes off his wife as his sister in order to avoid trouble. And the wife then is taken into the household of someone, into their harem, and but the husband is protected because of this. So Abraham features in two of these sister stories. And the first one is when Abraham goes to Egypt. And there he tells all the Egyptians that Sarah is his sister. And Sarah is taken into the household of the Pharaoh. And that's where the Islamic story really picks up. It talks about the details of what happens to Sarah. So Sarah is this woman of great virtue, and she's there in the house, in the harem of the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh is going to approach her to use her sexually. And Sarah gets down and does salat. She prays and asks God to protect her. And God sends some sort of convulsion or seizure on the Pharaoh. And each time that the seizure, she prays, Pharaoh has a seizure, and then he asks her to pray again to save him, and she does this. And this happens 3 times. And finally the Pharaoh gives up, and he says, enough of this. He sends her back to Abraham and gives her Hagar, this slave, as a token of goodwill, in a sense. Now, the Islamic story in the Hadith picks back up when Hagar is expelled for the last time. In the biblical story, she's expelled twice. But in the Islamic story, she's expelled from the house of Abraham. In the biblical story, that's because of this conflict between her and Sarah. Yet, in the Islamic story doesn't mention that. Rather, this is a test of Abraham and Hagar. So Abraham undergoes various tests in his life, the most famous one being the sacrifice of his son. But the first test, in this case, is God asks him to take Hagar to the Arabian Peninsula and leave her, abandon her in the desert. And so the scene is very similar to that of the biblical account. So Abraham packs up some food and packs up a small skin of water, actually some dates in a leather bag and a small skin of water, and takes her off into the Arabian desert, and then and tells her to sit in a certain spot. It's near where Mecca is, and then leaves. So this is just a very moving scene in the Hadith when Ibrahim leaves Hagar and Ishmael there in the desert and begins walking away. And Hagar begins to yell up back to him, "Are you just going to leave us here? Are you going to abandon us here in the desert without anyone to help us?" And he just can't bear to look back at her, so he just keeps on walking. And finally she yells, "Has God ordered you to do this? Like, is this a command? Is this the test of God?" And he says, "Yes, and God will not neglect us." And then he raises his hands up and he says this prayer to God that's recorded in the Quran, Surah 14, verse 37. "O our Lord, I have made some of my offspring dwell in a valley with no cultivation." It's unsettled. There's no one there. "By your sacred house," that's the Kaaba, "in order that they may offer prayers or perfect their prayers." So this is the idea of the test of faith. And so he continues his prayer. "So fill some hearts among men with love towards them and provide them with fruits so that they may give thanks." So Abraham takes Hagar and her son Ishmael and leaves them there in the desert. And it's very clear in the Islamic tradition that they both understand that God has asked Abraham to do this, and that this is a type of testing of their faith. Not only Abraham's faith, or in the Islamic tradition, Ibrahim, not only Ibrahim's faith, but also Hagar's faith. And then he walks back north. Meanwhile, Hagar there is left there with Ishmael, and of course, as in the biblical story, the water skin becomes empty. She uses it up, and then they begin to be very thirsty, and the child is crying. She begins to run looking for water. And she's running in between these two mountains on the outskirts of Mecca, Safa and Al Marwa. And she runs back and forth between these 7 times. And on the 7th time, then she hears this noise, and she runs back down to where Ishmael is, and she sees an angel. There's different versions of this, but she sees an angel like digging up the ground. And as she looks there then by Ishmael, she sees water starting to come out of the ground. And of course, this is the Zamzam well. But again, the angel shows her this well. And the angel then says to her, right, don't fear abandonment. God is not leaving you. God is not abandoning you, for the house of God, that's the Kaaba, will be built here by this boy and his father. And it says, God does not abandon his people. So we see a lot of similar elements here with the biblical story. We see the role of Ibrahim. We see the expulsion from the house of Ibrahim, the bag of food and the bag of water and it running out. Hagar there then alone in the desert, and then this divine intervention, which in which she is shown this well, has this very intimate encounter with God. She is shown a well, which allows her then to survive, her and her son to survive and become this great nation. In the Islamic tradition, it goes on to say that there were some Arabs passing through the area, probably a caravan, and they see some birds circling in the air around the well that had come up. And so they go over to see what it is, and there they meet Hagar and Ishmael. And they then settle here in this new oasis around the well, the Zamzam well. And this is then the beginning of the community of Mecca. And the story goes on to say that Ibrahim then would travel back and forth at different times from Canaan to Arabia. On one of these trips, God tests him again, asking him to sacrifice Ishmael. And this is the story of he takes him up on the mountains, about to sacrifice him, and then God provides a ram and prevents the sacrifice from taking place. And of course, that is enacted at the end of every Hajj month in Eid al-Adha, the Feast of Sacrifice, when Muslims will sacrifice a ram or a goat or sheep in memory of or reenacting God's intervention in the sacrifice of Ishmael. And then another time that Ibrahim comes back to Arabia, then he and Ishmael build the Kaaba together as the first house of God. So I just want to point out a few things that I think we can learn from the comparison of these two tales. The first thing just being that there is obviously this shared milieu of tales, of folk tales, in this Semitic culture. And you really only get the full story by putting together the versions from each of these cultures. The stories are very compatible. Of course, one notable feature is just the very important role that Hagar plays in the Islamic tradition as compared with the Judeo-Christian tradition. She's a woman who really knows God and encounters God in a way that Sarah never does. She has this very dramatic encounter with God, a very intimate encounter with God. God hears her cries of distress and comes down and and interacts, intervenes, and helps her in this very practical way. And so then she becomes, in Islamic tradition, sort of a paragon, a great example of the faith. She's a woman of great faith, of great bravery, of great perseverance, and it's really her actions that really are seen as instrumental in the founding of this Arab civilization. And she's the one who sort of lays the groundwork for what becomes the most holy place in the Islamic tradition, that is the community of Mecca. So perhaps a third point is we've really seen how the biblical and the Quranic traditions interact, but we also see something very interesting here, and that's how the Hadith and the Quran, both within the Islamic tradition, interact with one another. So we've got this one verse in the Quran, 1437, which is Ibrahim's prayer asking God to protect his family that he's leaving in the desert there near Mecca. But then the whole story is filled out in the Hadith. So really, the Islamic tradition is using the Hadith to fill the gaps in around this one Quranic verse and filling that story out. So there is this important interaction here between the Hadith and the Quran. So this interaction between the Quran and the Hadith is especially important when we look at how these actions of Hagar are ritualized within the Islamic tradition. Specifically, this running back and forth between the two hills, Safa and Marwa. And this is actually mentioned in the Quran. Again, we have one verse. This is Surah 2, verse 158. Surely the Safa and the Marwa, the two hills, are among the signs of God. It is therefore no sin for him who is on pilgrimage to the house, that's the Hajj, or performs the Umrah, that minor pilgrimage, to go around the two. And whosoever does good beyond what is obligatory, then surely then Allah is appreciative of good deeds and all-knowing. So again, here we've got one verse in the Quran, but then the meaning of that verse and the significance of that verse is found only in the interaction of that verse with this whole story out of the Hadith. So reenacting this scene from Hagar's life becomes this very core element in demonstrating faith in the Islamic tradition. So I guess one question that arises from this is, can you think of similar ritualizations of female characters and female actions in other religious traditions that are undertaken then by all members of that religious tradition? So these are just a few thoughts about the story of Hagar, how it is played out in the biblical, how the biblical and the Islamic traditions interact, and how it plays out within the Islamic tradition itself, that I hope that you find interesting and useful, and that you will continue to think about.